Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see such a big crowd here today. Some of you may know our second Saturday program is one of our most exciting programs we do. However, we take the months of July and August off. So it's always especially exciting to see everyone come back for our September second Saturday, since it's kind of the start of a fresh year for us. And to see such a great crowd for our first September second Saturday is wonderful. So we're very appreciative that you're here with us today. Whether this is your 20th time here or your first time, we're very glad to see you. We always have something going on here at the Berks History Center. And in particular, the next few weeks, we have lots and lots of programs. We have a history hike coming up. We have a barn tour coming up. We've got workshops in basket making and printmaking. We have Pennsylvania Dutch classes starting in a few weeks if you're interested in that. We have beginner, intermediate, and advanced level classes. So no matter what your skill level or interests, we have something for you if that appeals to you. We have our Road Ramble event is coming up in October, a driving tour through northern Berks County. And this year, we're especially excited. We're going from approximately Leesport, around Lake Onalani, through Virginville, and eventually to Kutztown. And we specifically look for places that are very off the beaten path. And I think it's our most scenic road ramble yet. So we're very excited about it. If you're interested in that, we'd love to have you join us. And if you have any questions about our programming, just stop by and ask me or check at our front desk. We can give you more information about any of the exciting things that are happening here today. We are also very excited to have with us Lynn Otto talking about forts of the Blue Mountains during the era of the French and Indian War. A lot of you probably are already aware of this, but the French and Indian War was a crazy, crazy time for the people here in Berks County. It was a time when their world was completely turned upside down. And there were so many complex political machinations tied up with the chaos that was ensuing on the frontier here in Berks County. So it was just a time like no other in our history. And we're so excited that Mr. Otto can be here to talk to us today about this time period. And just to tell you a little bit about him, if any of you are familiar with Bodo Otto, the Patriot surgeon who lived in Reading and was the surgeon at Valley Forge and other places during the American Revolution, Lynn is a Bodo Otto descendant. By the way, we have a Bodo Otto program coming up in January, so be on the lookout for that if it's of interest. But at any rate, Lynn is a descendant of Bodo Otto. He's from the Higgins area, a graduate of Tri-Valley High School, went to Williamsport Area Community College. And I asked him, Lynn, how did you get interested in this subject? And he said that as a youngster, he just developed a great interest in forts and the thought that there were forts right in the Blue Mountains, just in our backyard, was especially intriguing to him. So he really immersed himself in the subject. He sought out books on the subject, got involved in Conrad Weiser Homestead, and he's actually treasurer of the Friends of Conrad Weiser and has just been really immersed in the subject for many, many years. So we are absolutely delighted to have Lynn here with us. And I hope, please give a warm welcome to Lynn.
Thank you. Which is forward? That button or that button?
That's forward. Okay, that's backward.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Vicki tells me that I was here 20 years ago. And quite frankly, I don't remember that. But thank you for having me back. As Brad mentioned, I really have to give probably most of the credit for my interest in history to my dad. And especially with forts, because back in the 50s and 60s, after you came out from church, there were no malls or anything like that to go to. So Dad and I would go out and take walks. And we'd always get to where we were going, and on a return, my dad would always say, we need to get back to the fort before dark. And that always stuck with me. And then, as Brad said, I discovered that there were some forts at the Blue Mountain, along the Blue Mountains. And I started digging into that. So this PowerPoint is one that I put together first. And I told Brad, I was talking to a historian at one point in time, and he said, whenever you give a PowerPoint, the next time you give it, always update it. So yesterday I updated it for about 2 hours, and not necessarily changing the information, but there's always new graphs or images that you can use. And so I'm hopeful that you'll enjoy it. As Brad said, period of the French-Indian War from the declared war was 1756 to 1763 was a horrendous time in Berks County and in the surrounding areas. Even though it wasn't on a large scale, it still was very, very, very vicious. And there were a lot of things happening and a lot of things going on. Can you believe it? In politics. But my focus is on telling this story. And it's going to be about three cultures: British, French, and natives. And I'm telling you that I'm not taking any side in this. I'm just relating to you a story that actually happened, and I hope you enjoy. One other thing, I took the liberty to set my phone for 2 hours. So you'll be out by lunchtime. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So I have to remind you that we were all loyal British subjects at this point in time. We were not revolutionary for about 25 more years. At this point in time, when this was going on, there was no rumble hint of any kind of insurrection that was going to happen. We were loyal British subjects. Oops. So, as my wife always says when I give a talk, you always start at the beginning. So I've got to. So why was the colony of Pennsylvania so much different than some of the other original colonies? Well, the story lies at a place called Pennsbury Manor. Certain colonies such as Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania were granted to an individual or group by the British Crown, and they were granted full rights of self-government. Take notice, self-government. Penn family ruled Pennsylvania until the Revolution. Some of the other colonies, the king appointed a governor. In Pennsylvania, William Penn and then his family appointed the governors. They did not have to get the okay from the king. So, very different. And in the case of Pennsylvania, we have to give credit to William Penn the Younger. He set in motion a lot of native policies and created in what a history book about 10 years ago came out called Peaceable Kingdom. Things were going great. For 70 years, think about it. For 70 years, there was no warfare in Pennsylvania. There was one hiccup, and that was the walking purchase. And that's a totally different subject for another time. But other than that, natives, Europeans were getting along. But as time goes, things change. Now, one thing I have to bring up to start off with, William Penn was granted land in what today we know as Pennsylvania or Penn's Woods. But where or who owned the western boundary? You see by this chart that Connecticut claimed it, Virginia, Maryland. Nobody knew who owned Western PA, as we call it today, or the Pittsburgh area. It was simply called the Ohio Valley. Well, as things happen, the three cultures, you have the established Native Americans, you have the British on the East Coast, and you have the French. As happens, why do wars happen? Usually, a lot of things do not change. Power, prestige. In this case, it was natural resources. And that was the beaver and deer trade. 1749 was the first occasion, so we say, for excuse me, for French to make a statement. A Marine officer in the French Army plants 10 lead plates in the Ohio country in the name of France in 1749. His name was Celeron. This is one of the, this is the only fully intact lead plate that exists today. And I believe it is in a museum somewhere in Virginia. There is another half a plate, but these plates were tacked on trees or buried in the sand along the rivers, basically saying we now own this property. We claim it in the name of Louis XV. Next up was a series of forts that were built. First one was at Presque Isle, today Erie. Fort Le Boeuf at Waterford. Fort Michaud in Venango. And the last and the biggest threat was Fort Duquesne at the Forks of the Ohio. Right there. Today, if you go to Point State Park in Pittsburgh, you can see in a concrete outline the shape of Fort Duquesne. It's also very near the Fort Pitt Museum. If you look at that diagram, you realize how small the fort was. But nevertheless, in 1753, when Governor Dinwiddie sent George Washington on a mission to deliver a letter, George stood at the forks of the Ohio and said, "This is a very strategic point." France got there first. So, obviously, the threat of war was very imminent. So let's talk about the two warring Europeans. First, 1750, English colonists along the eastern seaboard numbered about 1 million people. 1 million. In French Canada, the Great Lakes, and New Orleans, the French population was about 60,000. 1 million and 60,000. How was France going to wage war and have any chance of winning? That was the key question. The French took allies. The Algonquin Nation. On the right is a unit called the French Milice. They were all volunteers. They were taken from parishes up in Quebec from ages 16 to 60. They were not paid, but the families that they left behind there were taken care of. On the right, we see a French Marine officer. There were two types of troops for the French. Troops de terre, which was ground forces, or troops de la marine, which was the forces that generally served on ships, but la marine was also became very important on ground operations. So what is la petite guerre? Troops participating in la petite guerre operated separately from the main army, often using speed and maneuver for quick attacks and ambushes in support of the army's goals, usually in small groups with a French soldier in command. That's what, along with the native allies, is what the French were doing. La petite guerre means little wars, and they became very good at it. After the defeat of Braddock in July of 1755, it left a path wide open for the French and Indian raiding parties coming east, right into Berks County. They first struck at Penn's Creek in October of 1755. The frontier was literally aflame. There was nothing to stop them from coming east. Remember? 70 years without war. Pennsylvania was totally unprepared for war because we did not need soldiers. We did not need any forts. We were totally unprepared. If you see smoke, you're probably too late to help. That was the case all through Berks and the surrounding areas. Scenes like this from 1755 through 1758 was common. Hitting fast and run. Burning farms, fields, killing the domestic animals. Can you imagine a knock on your cabin door to see these two gentlemen? Very unwelcome guests. And yes, there were captives. This is a very interesting subject on its own. Generally speaking, infants were of no use to them and were generally killed. Small children, they would be taken back and raised as part of the tribe. Young adults would be taken away and assimilated into the tribe. Guys like me at 70 years old, not so much. Not so much. So, what changed? What changed in Pennsylvania? What changed in our mindset? It took two farmers from Wilmersdorf area, loaded two mangled, scalped corpses, and took it down to the governor's house in Philadelphia. Where you see the governor ignored all the warning signs and letters that he was getting because he did not want people in Philadelphia to be alarmed. Well, that sort of changed things. Now, the Pennsylvania Assembly, the governing body of the colony of Pennsylvania at that time, was mostly Quakers. We love Quakers. They will not bear arms. But they would not appropriate money for soldiers or forts. Well, that even changed. And finally, in 1756, money was appropriated for the Pennsylvania Regiment and also for the building of forts. The 1st Battalion was commanded by Conrad Weiser. 2nd Battalion was commanded by John Armstrong, and the 3rd Battalion by William Clapham. Conrad Weiser had the territory of the Blue Mountains. John Armstrong was across the river, and William Clapham had the forts along the river, Fort Hunter, Fort Halifax, and later Fort Augusta. So why the forts? Well, at the time of the French and Indian War, the Blue Mountains marked the actual settlement line of the white men. The reason for the forts was to stop the flow of Indians and French into the valleys south of the Blue Mountains after Braddock's defeat. Here is a map that shows you some of the forts. And these from Hunter all the way up to Fort Allen were the forts that Conrad Weiser was in charge of. Just to show you, the river forts were Halifax and Augusta, and the forts on this side were in charge, John Armstrong was in charge. A lot of people don't realize this, but the forts in this area here, Lehigh, Norris, Hamilton, and Hinshaw, was actually commanded by Colonel Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin tried his military hat on. Unfortunately, I guess he had sights on different things because he only lasted less than a year as an officer. Now, that was the line of forts. The theory behind it was to have troops build these forts and then patrol back and forth, trying to intercept anything that was coming from the north to the south. As I said, gives me time to get a drink.
Must just be a loose plug.
We're good. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
As I said, Conrad Weiser was given the task of building forts along the Blue Mountains and commanding the troops to man and patrol them. The Pennsylvania Regiment gets his orders. This is the reenactment group that I've been involved in since the early 90s, I guess it is. And we portray Weiser's battalion, the 1st Battalion, Pennsylvania Regiment, and also the 3rd Battalion, which is the Augusta Regiment in Sunbury. Just about 5 years ago, a reenactment group started the 2nd Battalion, and I think it was 3 years ago at a reenactment at Fort Frederick in Maryland. All 3 battalions were together for the first time in over 250 years. That was a pretty cool moment. As I said, their duty was to try to patrol. So we'll start going from west to east in the forts. Fort Hunter was built in 55 or 56 at the junction of the Susquehanna River and Fishing Creek. A stockade wall was built around an existing log house. The garrison size at the fort was 36 men with Captain Thomas McKee in command. Now, I do just want to stop for a second and tell you that, as far as I know, the only archaeological dig that was done on the Blue Mountain forts was at Fort Hunter, and was done by the State Museum. And it was usually in the fall, and it was done for many years. I would go down and I would observe and ask questions. Unfortunately, the dig no longer happens because after a period of years, they could not find the stockade. They did find the bake oven of the fort. The theory now is there's a 19th century stone house at Fort Hunter Park, and they're now thinking that perhaps the fort is underneath or in the covered in the basement of Fort Hunter. I used two sources when I started my journey on this, and the first one is in 1896, the Pennsylvania Museum Commission published a 2-volume set of the Pennsylvania forts, and they had people actually going out, mapping it, trying to see if there was anything left. So this is a map from the volumes, and you'll be seeing more of these maps. The other modern day book was written in 1960 by William Hunter. It's called the Pennsylvania Frontier Forts. If you want to know more about this subject, that is the book to get. Just by the way, it's available at the Conrad Weiser Homestead Museum store, if you're interested. Fort Monadnock Gap was built at Monadnock Gap to protect the trail to the Clarks and Lycans valleys. It was constructed by Frederick Smith, and it was about 12 miles from Fort Hunter. And right in the middle there, that's the location of the fort. If you're taking 443 toward Fort Hunter, there is a golf course, and on the left-hand side is where the marker is for the fort. Fort Swatara, built at the gap in the mountain through which the Swatara Creek flowed through. It was a log wall built around existing house and barn, and in the fall of 1755 on the property of Peter Hedrick. It's commanded by Captain Frederick Smith. The interesting thing about Fort Swatara was that, as I said, as it says here, the log palisade was built around existing buildings. Well, there was a major problem with the barn because the barn had a thatched roof. Not going to last too long with fire arrows. So they had to change that. A lot of these forts were built around existing buildings. And this was one. And another interesting thing, it describes Fort Swatara in the shape of a weaver's shuttle. It's long and narrow. And if you get off of Route 81 at the Lickdale exit and take 72 or 443 north, you'll go up about a mile or two outside of town, and there's a road called Fort Swatara Road to the left, and Fort Swatara is location is back there. Fort Henry, built on the land owned by Dietrich VI, 14 miles east of Fort Swatara. It was constructed of heavy timbers with a wall of loose stone inside. That's always puzzled me why they would have done that. It's the most formidable of all the forts along the Blue Mountains, commanded by Captain Christian Busey of Reading. Christian Busey had property along with Conrad Weiser in downtown Reading. He was a doctor. Later on in the war, Captain Busey got sick and died. And in Conrad Weiser's journals, he says that he paid for Christian Busey's funeral. And it is located just off the Tulpehocken path. Another interesting thing in one of the descriptions says that the inside buildings of Fort Swatara had clay tile, which means breadware tile, which is, I think, very interesting. And this was actually built from the ground up. Now, in my journey, initially, I got all these maps and I was sorting them out. If I could go, I went to the locations. This one had me puzzled for probably 20 years, and I'll tell you why. Down here, it says Millersburg. Now, the only Millersburg that I'm familiar with is out Route 25 to the river in Dauphin County. Now, how I couldn't make any heads or tails of it. Now, I put this in to give you an idea of Route 501 is today. So about 20 years ago, I'm driving back and forth to the homestead, and there's a little town called Bethel. And I was coming from Raresburg into the beginning of Bethel. Right there was a sign, and it said, founded by James Miller. I must have passed that 100 times until it finally, and it says, formerly called Millersburg. Interesting thing happened at Fort Henry. Again, this is a story for another time, but October 1757, I believe it was the 12th, a lone French soldier stumbled out of the wilderness and surrendered at Fort Henry. His name, Michael La Cheviggerie. Barely 16 years old, he was the son of the commandant at Fort Michaud. He was given charge at 16 of this La Petite Guerre party coming east. They did their destruction, they had their captives, and they started back west. Somewhere along the way, La Cheviggerie notices he dropped this loaf of bread that he had in his coat. So he stops and backtracks to try to find it. Couldn't find it. He looked around. The party was gone. He fired his fusee twice in the air. Nothing. He wandered around and crossed the river twice until he finally stumbled at Fort Henry and they took him prisoner. He was taken to Conrad Weiser's house. He was interrogated there and then sent to Ready, where he was again interrogated. Make a long story short, for years and years and years, I did not know what happened to this young man. And finally, with some help from another friend in New York, I found out that he was involved in a prisoner swap and did get to go home. This is the only documented French soldier in Berks County that I can put a name to. It's a very, very interesting story, a lot more to it. As I said, it's a story for another time, but that happened right at the homestead. Fort Northkill, 11 miles east of Fort Henry. It was a stockade fence built very badly, only 45 feet square. It was named for the North Kill Creek, and it was commanded by a sergeant. Right there. That location is currently off of Bloody Springs Road, off of 183. Fort Lebanon, 11 miles east of Northkill. It was built by Jacob Morgan in 1756. It was 100-foot square, 14-foot high, and had a 30 by 20 storeroom within, and a spring inside, and a 12-foot square magazine. This is one of the forts that is very perplexing. For it, of the Blue Mountain forts, is the only fort that is situated north of the Blue Mountains. I've not been able to find any documentation as to why it was placed north of the Blue Mountains. And the site of this is at just outside of present-day Auburn. Fort Franklin, 19 miles from Fort Lebanon, named after Colonel Benjamin Franklin, very poorly built. William Parsons wrote to Franklin in 1756 and said, "Some people have graced the fort at Alamango with your name, and I don't blame them for it, but I am sure it will not grace your name till it is put into better condition than it is at present." Meaning, and it wasn't too well of a built fort. Next one is Fort Allen. This is the only Blue Mountain fort with an existing drawing of what it looked like, and it was done by Benjamin Franklin. It had a 18-foot high stockade fence and had swivel guns mounted on the bastions. This is a 19th century woodcut of the building of Fort Allen, and this is supposedly Benjamin Franklin here, sitting watching. And this is the drawing that exists of Fort Allen. It is one of the strangest design forts that I've ever seen. So they had a swivel gun here and here. The reason that you have all these bumps or arrows out, those were the bastions, so that if you're up on the wall, you can look out this way. If you're over here, you can look this way, so all the sides are visible. Just as a side note, the end of September, my reenactment units are going up to Weisport, where Fort Allen was built, and a historical society there contacted us, and we're going to have a program for them on Fort Allen. Those people are really, really proud of their heritage and especially the fort. The well still exists there, so we're looking forward to that. So let's have a wrap up. Were the forts a success? In a two-year period from 1756 to 1758, 200 documented cases of settlers killed in the Tulpehocken Valley. Now notice it says documented cases. My thoughts are that that number is probably tripled because a lot of the captives were taken away and never saw again. They're probably somewhere in unmarked graves. In the same period, only 40 natives were killed by soldiers on patrol. So, to wrap this up, was it a success? Not so much. But one thing it did do, it did give the settlers in the areas where the forts were around a sense of Big Brother was there to help you. Very similar to the case in World War II, when Japan, for the first year or 2 years of the war, they were running rampant. And then Jimmy Doolittle took some B-25 bombers off the USS Hornet and flew over and bombed Tokyo. Militarily, not a success, but morale-wise, a huge boost to our troops, and even more the people in the United States. So I sort of draw a comparison there. I think they both had their negatives, but I think they also had a great positive in boosting morale. So on a snowy day, I say thank you and good day. So, anybody have any questions?